How are you guys? Are you enjoying Anarchapulco? My first time here, I'm so excited. Slow me down. Hey, how many of you know where you were on the morning of 9/11/2000? Everybody. It shocked us, right, to the core. I remember watching the towers coming down. I mean, it looked like a damn waterfall. I'm going, I didn't have a mental process of how to deal with this information because I was in shock, right? We're being attacked. We didn't know when the next plane was coming. It's like, and they had the answers for us really quickly, you know? And it was like, oh, okay, I got my answer. I'm going to put it aside and I'm going to go back to work. I mean, nobody wants to go back there. That was a painful place. Never seen a high-rise collapse by fire before, so we didn't even know how to evaluate it. I just went back to my architecture job with high schools at the time. Like these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area and this $125 million high school. I was a flag-waving Republican. I wanted to get those bastards who did this to us. I watched Colin Powell as he was making his indisputable case for weapons of mass destruction against Saddam Hussein and his ties to Al-Qaeda. You remember that? I trusted my government. But something happened on March 29th, 2006. I was on my way back from a high school project, and I heard on the radio from Bonnie Faulkner on Guns and Butter, Pacifica radio program. It was David Ray Griffin that she was interviewing. He was talking about the explosive testimony from 118 firefighters, all of whom saw, heard, or experienced directly explosions. They were being blown around in the buildings. Some of them before the planes hit, by the way. Most of them before the towers collapsed. You're going to hear about that today. I'm going to share my journey with you because I had to get to the bottom of this. I had to know what was really going on. David Ray Griffin was talking about the ends of the beams dripping with molten metal. That a third tower came down. Wait a minute, I'm an architect. I would have heard if a third tower came down. The American Institute of Architects, with 80,000 members, and I'm one, didn't issue one bulletin on this third worst structural failure in modern history. Not one. This is the most uninformed group of professionals you could ever imagine. Well, I pulled my van over. I couldn't drive anymore. I was listening to this. I had to know the truth. I mean, this would mean it to be the biggest scam in history. The crime of the century. It couldn't be true. I went to see David Ray Griffin speak a few days later in the Grand Lake Theater in Oakland. It was packed. I couldn't get in. It was sold out. 600 people. So I had to go home and watch on the live stream. For those of you on the live stream, thank God for live stream, right? You get to see in the comfort of your own home and not miss a thing here at Anarchapulco. What I heard on that live stream and saw shocked me to my core. I searched online after that a few weeks to verify the truth. Once I looked at it and saw the evidence, I had to admit I had been lied to, deceived. I felt deeply betrayed. That's what crossed my line in the sand. What crosses your line about what you've learned and will learn here at Anarchapulco? Call me naive, but again, prior to this moment, I trusted my government like I trusted my father. I got real angry. I was resolute. I had to get to the bottom of it. I spent hundreds of hours researching the forensic evidence that they weren't showing us on CNN. I bought pizza for the 15 architects in the firm I worked for. I made them come. I bribed them. You guys got to see this. They thought I was nuts before this. They sat and watched 45 minutes of the presentation you're going to see tonight. They came away, all of them, stunned to the core like myself. They signed the petition that I had just started, demanding a new investigation, a real investigation, into the destruction of the 3 towers on 9/11. Now we have 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation. So I'm going to share that journey with you too. I took the opportunity to work in a larger firm here, and with larger projects, which was an awesome experience for me. $400 million project with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. So let's get into it. 9/11. The sound of it just kind of brings many of us back to a state of terror inside, right? That morning. We couldn't really question what we were told. It would be unpatriotic. You'd be betraying the troops who were doing their patriotic duty. So we were in a state of cognitive dissonance. We're being told X, Y, Z, but what we saw was A, B, C. It's too much for the brain. We shut down, we move on with our life, right? How many of you had that experience? Quite a number, okay. So what we're talking about is a psychological operation on the American people and the people of the world. Terror, yes, but against the American people. By who? We're going to point to some of these possibilities because, you look at means and motive, opportunity. We had the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And if we could get the confidence monitor working, I'd know which slide I'd be on without looking behind me. The global war on terror, loss of civil liberties through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, where any of us can be arrested now for just being associated with terrorism, which is not defined, or using force, which is not defined. How many of you have lost your YouTube videos because of things like hate speech, which are not defined? Policies of torture, homeland security, a police state, Middle East injustices, invading the Middle East with now 5, 6 wars, in which we've killed 2 million people, lost many, many soldiers. The draining of our treasury in a $6.5 trillion global war on terror. And of course, the surveillance state, spying on all our emails and so forth. It's all illegal, but we tacitly, as Max alluded to, endorse it. And Larkin Rose, we tacitly endorse it with voting and by not speaking out. Speaking of which, how many of you are familiar with this 3rd tower, Building 7? Okay, let me ask you this. How many of you are not familiar with Building 7? I'm hoping there'll be some of you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Awesome. So that's good. We're going to fix that tonight. Here's a 47-story skyscraper, easily the tallest building in most of our states. It's kind of dwarfed next to the Twin Towers. But this is the 3rd tower that was hit. Now, it's part of the World Trade Center complex. It wasn't hit by an airplane. And yet, it goes down. Heather, can we turn on the confidence monitor, please? Okay, thank you, dear. Now, here it is standing still after the towers went down. It's fine. It's got some damage from beams. A few beams hit it. But that's not the reason it came down. According to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain the collapse, all 3 collapses to the American people. Well, let's see how they did. And there we go. We got a little bit of a delay. So here's the collapse. The east penthouse falls first. 6 seconds later, what happens? Mamma mia. I can say that. We're in Mexico. Okay, so you get a sense of why this is on the radar of 3,000 architects and engineers. Let's see what the official story says about this collapse.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Fire? What fires? Oh, these fires. There were some fires in the building. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. So those fires brought this building down. Here they are here on the 12th floor, an area of concern for NIST's collapse initiation theory, but they're moving away from the area that they focus on, and we'll get into that in more detail in the DVDs, which we have available for you straight outside. So they do this computer model to prove their theory that this building came down due to fire. Okay, here's the actual video. Here's NIST's $6 million computer model. It doesn't look anything like the video, though, right? It's collapsing completely top to bottom. It crumples in and bulges out and begins to tip over, and so they stop the entire model 2 seconds after the beginning of the collapse. 400 structural steel connections failing every second in their model. If that happened, there would have been massive breaking up of granite panels and windows in the building. So you can see they're starting out on quite shaky ground. So we submitted a FOIA request saying, hey, let's see the computer input data. This is a relatively public building. It's certainly a public failure. Let's find out what you did put into the computer to get this out. They won't release it. They deny it, citing that it might jeopardize public safety. Well, it certainly does jeopardize public safety to deny the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety to withhold that information from them so we can evaluate. After all, there's hundreds of similarly designed buildings. My lips are sealed. No, they're not. So what do we think about this so far? Is there a reason for a new investigation just after 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Yeah? Yeah, I think so too. We're getting a new investigation. We've got legal actions, which I'll tell you about, and right now, I guess. We've submitted the evidence you're going to see today, and about 10 times more than that, to the U.S. Attorney. And by law, he's promised to abide by the law which requires him to submit this to a special grand jury. And it's taking time. So we're suing them with a mandamus lawsuit, which requires them, it forces the court, the U.S. Attorney, by the court, to get on with it. We've also sued the FBI. And the FBI has our evidence. We've given it to them. They actually said in a letter to us that this seems backed by thorough research and analysis. We're going, wow, thank you. That was Michael Heimbach, chief assistant to the counterterrorism division in the FBI. Well, he got fired, and we can't get anything out of the FBI now, so we sued him. So we're all over it. And the court actually actually approved the motion to dismiss by the FBI. So we're appealing it now. So these things have to go up the ladder. Guess? No, I don't have a crystal ball. Appeals take months, sometimes years. How many of you have been frustrated with your experience with the legal process? Okay, question? That's a good question. The plane that went down in Shanksville, was it intended to hit Building 7 or the White House or the Capitol? There's a lot of speculation. There's not much research that reveals specific information. Here we go. So I'll take you back now here. So we have never had a fire brought down a high-rise before 9/11, ever. Not one. Not a steel frame, fireproofed high-rises. So we found, hey, there's a study in 1995 in the UK. They actually built a mid-rise out of steel frame, fireproofed and non-fireproofed. And they set an incredible amount of fuel in it, got 2,000-degree fires out of this somehow, and here's what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had the first three. Not one, not two, but three. Before that, not any high-rises have fallen due to fire. They've fallen due to other reasons, in this case, earthquakes, or organic collapse, if you will. It falls over to the path of least resistance. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. We recognize a building certainly mangled at the bottom. This is not what we see in any of the three towers. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds with a solidly defined edge and an expanding volume with cauliflower shapes that are produced by the incredible heat from the chemical reactions in the explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. So you see, it's not too difficult to tell an explosion from a collapse. And of course, we can harness explosions quite effectively in tall buildings like these, like the old hotels in Las Vegas. You might be familiar with those, where they place thousands of shaped floor by floor. So this is what you get. And there's a series of features associated with these. We have a sudden onset of destruction. Let's see if we have that feature at Building 7. Here's Dan Rather.
Are high shots. Now, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen.
You're calling it on day one, right? We didn't hear him on television. 2 of controlled demolitions. Let's look. We have, it falls into its own footprint. The center, Building 7 on the left, a known controlled demolition on the right. Investigation into the possible building collapses. You can see why we have the hate by the lack of action from the government that we used to trust. How do they bring a building straight down? You have to remove all second or so after that. Any deviation in that pattern, the building will tip over. This is really difficult to do. There's only a handful of companies in the United States that can handle this. And yet, fire has that precision to bring this building down symmetrically? Are you kidding me? Those fires? How fast is the building coming down? Let's go to David Chandler, high school physics teacher.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to freefall. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found its own structure with zero resistance.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is...
For the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist, and that's impossible. Reaction.
That's a third of its 7-second fall. How about the debris? It falls like a house of cards. Ejection, and yet it falls as in a pile 4 or 5 story. You recognize the building as a building. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. Do we have sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. Let's go to the official story first. Hey, I'm talking to you. All right, let's go to the witnesses who heard explosions, because NIST denies that there were any explosions.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were busted out, and it was horrifying. Dashed down all the way to the ground.
Well, there's an important whistle.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was a boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something.
Bill Rosati, he was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell.
And I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
It walked back into the building after it had been evacuated, which was after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. This is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more. Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs, like this one heard by these firefighters in the late morning of 9/11.
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
And yet explosions are not a part of the official story for any of the 3 towers, other than the explosions, of course, by the planes hitting the Twin Towers. How about feature number 8, incredible heat? The National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 is the guide in this country for the investigation of fire and explosion. They say, look for large volumes of gas and a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes, cauliflower-shaped plumes of hot gases, like we see racing away in every direction following the collapse or the destruction of this building. 35 miles an hour. That takes a lot of heat to expand all those gases, a lot more heat than we have available in this building. Those fires were probably put out by the action of the collapsing building. Heat maybe on the order of this. Where's that coming from? We're going to be looking at that later. Well, let's look at it now, because the NASA records hot spots, as we see, and evidence of molten metal from structural engineers who were hired to come out and investigate this. Abolhassan Astani Azal, for instance.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
Wait, you saw what? I saw melting of girders. Fires don't melt girders. This girder is melted. Why? That becomes extremely important. In fact, the author of the FEMA report says steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. But guess what? It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. The fires are only getting half that? No, a quarter of that normal office fires, which this is called. FEMA did the first investigation. They did a metallurgical examination. They found what in this Appendix C, in the official report, which was great, never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see here. Fires don't do this. NIST says, hey, we couldn't test the steel. NIST took over the investigation from FEMA, threw out the Appendix C, the metallurgical examination, and said they found no steel. But here we have the co-project leader for NIST, John Gross, on the pile, finding the very piece of steel that he gave to FEMA early on, and which ended up in their Appendix C, which he then threw out of the final investigation. His shadow is all over the evidence. So we have some key characteristic features and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. That's typical of fires. What do the experts say? Here's Danny Jawenko, one of the top experts in Europe on this.
Danny Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Wow, that's important. How about Swiss Federal Institute of Engineering, Structural Engineering? In my opinion, World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. How about one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, Kamal obeyed a localized failure in a steel frame building cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. What does that sound like? Not something fire can do, no. And this is why the University of Alaska got involved 4 years ago in a $300,000 contract with us, paid for by you, our supporters. The only way we can do this kind of thing. They really did the job, finite element analysis, challenging the work that NIST did to see, no other tall building had ever failed due to fire. Steel frame buildings hadn't failed. So ensuring public safety is really important because there's so many of these buildings that were similarly designed. So they examine the response to the fire loads. They rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse, and they identify the types of failures and locations that could have contributed to the collapse. They use the same input data that NIST did, finding, by the way, that most of it was fraudulently falsified by NIST, but they used it so that they could find out, and they said, gosh, let's simulate the structural response to the effect of the fire. And they examine NIST's collapse initiation hypothesis, and they simulate numerous failure scenarios. And they do quite a bit of detailed work, as you can imagine. And this is the area in the northeast corner next to column 79, which is said to have collapsed first. So they re-examine this whole thing, and they find that it didn't behave at all like what NIST said. Remember, NIST wouldn't release their computer input data and now we know why. They omitted 30 shear studs, which tie the beam, that big girder was supposed to be pushed off of its seat on this column 79. So they omit those key structural components, and these key structural components, stiffeners, which would have required that girder to be pushed all the way off of its seat. They found that floor 13 couldn't have fallen at all, but if it did, it wouldn't have broken floor 12 because there's all these girders underneath as well. They found that the entire movement of the fire is not this way, but this is the biggest movement, and it's out. So this wall wasn't infinitely stiff, as NIST modeled. It all progressed, it progressed and bowed out the exterior wall. So these are some of the key findings. They said, gosh, it didn't fail, these columns. And if they did, the building would have tipped over, which you can imagine, right? You have a failure of a few columns in an asymmetrical building or symmetrical. They said fire didn't cause the collapse of Building 7. The temperature wasn't high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. It was fireproofed, but NIST ignored the fireproofing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. The collapse of Building 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns. So we compare the model produced by the University of Alaska to the video. They look pretty similar to this monstrosity created by NIST, who Sham Sunder got up there publicly and said, and it matches quite well the behavior of the building. And you can see for yourself it's anything but that. Let's go on and see, because if you were going to have a controlled demolition, people would know about it. in advance? Let's look at that. Listen to these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion, looking back over their shoulder at the building, then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building as it's coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back here. All right, guys? Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
What? The building's about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? Excuse me? How about Kevin McPadden? We heard him talk about those explosions he experienced. He was held back 6 blocks from the building because they were worried that it was going to come down, as you just saw, due to those massive fires, which weren't. And he's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. This is what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
What? 2 fires bring buildings down to countdowns now? This is extraordinary. As well as the BBC's announcing the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it even happened, along with the reason why. Due to structural weakening when the towers went down. Wait, does this make them psychic? Because they apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. My God. So we have 10 key characteristic and uncharacteristic features with additional support for the hypothesis of explosive demolition. Fire doesn't create these. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, we call this proof of controlled demolition. How many of you are inclined to agree with the 3,000 architects and engineers? And how many are not? How many believe this came down by fire alone? Fire alone. Any? Because I don't want to shame you. We don't do that here at Anarchapulco. But that's the reason we raised $250,000 in 2013 to put billboards, taxis. Did you know a 3rd tower came down on 9/11? We're trying to educate the public, and we need your support. I'll give you an opportunity to do that. But first, I want you to know about the Twin Towers. Let me do a quick poll first. How many of you, if I haven't shamed you enough already, forgive me. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. How many believe the plane impacts and fires brought the buildings down, according to the government story? And how many of you are unsure, and how many of you that believe controlled demolition brought them down? First, plane impacts and fires. No reason to believe otherwise. This is what our government has told us. Is there anybody? Because you may not be familiar with this evidence. That's fine. I don't see any, but it would be great if I... How many of you are unsure? Wait, you haven't seen the evidence yet. You're here to check this out, find out more. You're unsure. Go ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So, how many of you think this, I've already looked at the evidence and believe this came down by controlled demolition? All right, the rest of you. So, we know where we are. Let's see what happened that morning.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So when it was attacked again, he immediately...
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
The guy in the street, of course, has it before all the engineers. So the official story says, raging fires under these floors at the point of jet plane impacts caused the sagging of these floor trusses, which caused the pulling in of all the perimeter columns around the building at once. There's serious problems with all of this. We can't get into all of it. I can tell you that these are at the point of jet plane impact, at the point of collapse, just prior, these fires are severely diminished. Thick black smoke indicating oxygen-starved buildings. Hey, let's look at the model and see if the features of the Twin Towers have the features of controlled demolition. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? And standing still, and then a smooth, sudden descent without any jolt or impact upon hitting the steel below. How about the North Tower, or South Tower here? Standing still and then a smooth, sudden, just like controlled demolition. What happened to the structure that was supporting that, or would have supported it as it began and impacted? Is there a patterned explosion and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? As I mentioned, this is the oral histories that David Ray Griffin was talking about. Not until August of 2005 did we even know that they existed, because the city of New York was hiding them. The court state of appeals forced the city to release this to the New York Times, and they actually published the transcripts of these. What do we find? Here's a few of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running underneath my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. You're going to see in these quotes again and again the order of events. They're feeling the ground shaking. They're seeing explosions. They're feeling explosions. And then the tower collapses. It's not the tower collapsing that's producing these events. Shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top, simultaneously from all four sides. Material shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television, when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's see what they're talking about. The North Tower compared to a controlled demolition. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like one, at least in the first 4 seconds here. Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper. I'm going to go real rapidly through these because we're running short, and I can assure you, you can watch all of these on the DVD. And the South Tower, is there any similarity to a known controlled demolition on the left? I thought the terrorist planted explosive somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions appeared to go completely around the building. Another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fire which blew out more debris. Not one of these witnesses appear in any of the reports of NIST about explosions. You know, like when they demolish a building? That's what I thought I saw. Did you see flashes? Yeah, I saw them too. I thought it was just me. No. Everybody at that point still thought these things were blown up, so I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were here when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? Some enterprising journalist says. No, when it exploded. Let's listen to a couple of them.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet, probably.
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
I
an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
This goes on for 10 minutes. All of these witnesses on video produced by mainstream television. Does it even look like a collapse? Or does it look more like a massive explosion like in the Tongan Sea in 2009 with upward, outward arching streamers, geometry of fireworks? After the first 4 seconds, this is what happens. We have a straight down symmetrical progression. Yeah, it's pretty straight down and symmetrical, take my word for it. But look at this. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, asymmetrical damage from the loading of the off-center top of the South Tower, the one that was tipping over at 22 degrees. Asymmetrical damage from the fires, but look, all the way down the building, all 4 sides in the videos you can see. Complete symmetrical progression. It makes no sense. It's a non sequitur. Let's zoom in on some of those. What are we looking at here? We're told this is a gravitational collapse. What do we see with our own eyes? I'm seeing dozens of explosions right there before our eyes. They don't show you some of these videos. And racing down the same corner, these explosions rapidly advancing almost as fast as the freely falling debris. We're told this is from a gravitational collapse, where you can see them developing up here in the corner too. And what we have is a 1,200-foot diameter of debris. The material is blown outside the footprint, well outside the boundary of ground zero. People wondering, where's all the steel? Because the pile, which we'll get to, is small. It's been delivered. All of it's there. It's just delivered well outside, crushing 600 feet away the Winter Gardens in Manhattan. Steel frame is completely broken up, cut up, ready for loading and shipment. Here's the nice, neat pile of Building 7, a classic implosion, like the old hotels in Las Vegas. You want to control that stuff. Apparently, they didn't see the need to control this. It's completely uncontrolled. By the way, if 100,000 tons of structural steel is blown outside the footprint, what's left to crush the building? Concrete, maybe? We'll get to that in just a minute. How about the ejections of these building materials? Take a look. We see these isolated ejections here, here, here. They're occurring in a geometric pattern, some of them. They're 150 feet per second. Physicists are clocking their speeds. They're 60 stories down, or 40 or 20 below what we're told is a gravitational collapse. We don't see a lot of this out there. And on the left side of Building 2, the South Tower, you see dozens of these isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. It's basically liquefying the structure inside of that building. And how fast is the building coming down? And we can count it. Here's 3 seconds, 5, 7. In about a dozen seconds, both towers have completely been brought to the ground, destroyed, and
we are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
That's pretty fast. That's almost free fall acceleration. That means it's accelerating straight down faster and faster and faster each second through what? Through 100,000 tons of structural steel, which is designed 5 times stronger than it needed to be to support that in the first place. Where did it go? Look at it another way. On a giant crane, we drop 2 massive 20-story buildings, and one over nothing but air, the other over, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist it. NIST is basically saying when you release the lever on these and drop them both at once, that they come down at the same time. No, this is 7th grade physics. We know this is going to slow down when it impacts the structure, but it didn't. Look at it another way.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and that's why we have peer-reviewed papers submitted by members of AE 911 Truth in journals. And do we have the total shattering of the structural steel frame? The National Fire Protection Association says, look for effects of explosions in your investigation. NIST helped write this part of the NFPA. Look for shrapnel effects, high-order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small, pulverized debris, with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances, as we've seen, and completely dismembered, broken up, ready for shipment, these core columns into their 37.5-foot lengths. What about the lateral ejection of these structural steel elements? Again, the NFPA says look for blast pressure wave effects. Well, that's what we have, hurling these 4- and 8-ton structural sections laterally outside the tower in a 600-foot diameter, like this one here heading toward Building 7. Whoa, wait a minute. That's freely flying. It must start out horizontally to then obtain a force by gravity, pulling it down 45 and then even more. What's the lateral force acting on this? It's not a gravitational collapse. How does gravity work? Down. Yeah. And there's enough explosive energy in each of these ejections to send a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. You see, it's all in the physics. We're talking science here. What about the concrete? Well, there should be 110 floors, each of them an acre in size. They should be stacked up. I don't see 50. We haven't seen 10. We haven't found 1 floor. Where did they go? They're missing. In a real gravitational collapse, like here in Mexico, we have pancakes. No pancakes in the Twin Towers. Where are the floors? Oh, there's the concrete, pulverized in midair. In all the photographs and videos, 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to 100-micron particles, laid like a blanket throughout Lower Manhattan in a 3-square-mile area. By the way, if 90,000 tons, 180,000 tons altogether of concrete is not is outside the perimeter of the building, what's left to crush the building? It wasn't the steel. That's outside too. The concrete, there's none of it virtually in the perimeter of these buildings inside. What do the experts say? Again, 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition. This one, William Rice. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration. With additional experts agreeing, including seismologists who say, hey, this had to have been explosives. This wasn't the collapse of a building that produced these seismic events 20 miles away. How about the pyroclastic-like clouds again? Thermal effects NIST says to look for. Again, we see pyroclastic-like clouds with cauliflower-shaped plumes ejected, increasing 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. An incredible amount of heat has to go into producing this. Heat like we might see again in something like that. Not something like this, whose fires were surely extinguished, or would have been, in a gravitational collapse, and there'd be virtually no heat left at the bottom of the pile. But let's look at the bottom of the pile, because what are we going to see? Incredible amounts of heat, unexplained in the official story.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it was just a bright reddish-orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's when the fire is going to still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Is anybody puzzled where all this heat is coming from? A red-hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. Again and again and again, the firefighters, the structural engineers are talking about all of this incredible phenomena that they've never seen in normal office fires. In fact, the World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, cites this stuff. A river of steel, he says. Glowing metal falling out of the hands of the crab claw excavators. And we have concrete that melted around everything in its path, according to this exhibit from the Police Museum in Manhattan. I didn't even know concrete could melt. It takes 3,000 degrees to melt concrete, partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. And the steel documented, even steel from the steel bent in all kinds of twisted shapes, that takes 2,000 degrees to even occur. And again, the FEMA report completely eliminated by NIST, but it showed World Trade Center Twin Towers steel also curled to, thin to almost razor sharpness. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron, that's molten iron, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt iron. Attack, sulfur attack on the steel. No clear explanation. We don't know where the sulfur came from. But here it is in this biggest, deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, according to the New York Times. But the fires, even jet fuel only gets to be about 600 degrees. So there's nothing magic about the jet fuel. It's basically kerosene. So what's creating these temperatures? Because the fires are maybe 1,200 degrees, plus, minus, but steel had melted. As you can see here, the temperature of the steel in its melting condition tells you, the color of the steel tells you the temperature. That's just the physics of this material. So what caused it to melt? We've got to look for evidence. So I went further and examined the work of Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist, who did some incredible work. Here he is here on this film by 9/11 Mysteries.
It's an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate.
Product of thermite. It would explain the extreme temperatures, 4,000 degrees it issues. And it would explain the sulfur. Sulfur's added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. But did they find this material in any? Well, later they acknowledge, a year later, that they never looked for it. You can't find what you're not looking for or won't. Others did, including Professor Stephen Jones. He finds that, gosh, if thermite were used, you'd have a tall-tale pattern, like molten iron, which is pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. You'd have a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, which rises off of the material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. And you'd have this.
The grapplers were
fires or kerosene, jet fuel. But what's on the ends of this beam that's smoking so incredibly? Whitish cloud of aluminum oxide gas? Lots of it on both towers, all the collapses. He said it would also leave behind all kinds of other evidence, as you see here, including iron. And we have, so he rules out structural steel as a component because it's elemental iron, not steel. And he also finds that there's manganese and fluorine, which come from the ingredients of thermite. So he does testing on artwork that's been sent to him, the slag, and he finds the signature of thermite. He finds that the U.S. Geological Survey, doing toxicological studies or dust analysis of the dust in 2005, finds what? Billions of previously molten iron microspheres. They're elemental iron. It's not from the welding workers. There's up to many tons of this material. The group says these are formed during the event, but we won't speculate or try to find out where they might have really come from, right? So much of it, it's actually not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these molten iron microtubes. Well, how are they formed? Aerosolized liquid iron is sent out, and it forms itself into drops, which cool and fall as molten iron droplets. Could that explain the toasting of the tops of these cars around the World Trade Center? But what else was found in the dust? A team of 8 international scientists, led by Niels Harrit, does analysis on this, finds red-gray chips. They come up to a magnet, they get real curious. They zoom in and find the ingredients of thermite in what amounts to 10 tons of this material. By extrapolation, you can figure it out. They zoom in 50,000 times, find very high-tech iron oxide. They ignite at an incredible temperature, 420 degrees Celsius. They produce spheres, the same spheres that are found in all the World Trade Center dust with the same chemical analysis. So we know where those spheres came from. They came from very high-tech material that in this peer-reviewed study, 25 pages, Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal finds unreacted material. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. So we've got the evidence. We just need to bring it. Failures in history. The evidence was sent to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it. So we have the evidence of 10 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition with the incendiaries, right? This is proof of controlled demolitions, leading 3,000 architects and engineers to demand a new investigation. And the only reason we can continue our work is because we have 2,000 members, and we need you to join us, because this is a real problem, right? The bigger problem is not the buildings here, right? It's the murder of 3,000 people. Even greater than that, we have problems if this was obviously some sort of an inside operation. We're not going to speculate, but we've seen that incendiaries and explosives brought down the towers. But this takes months of advanced planning, execution. Who had the means, the motive, the opportunity to execute this crime? These are the questions that the government, criminal investigators, journalists, and the mainstream media should be asking, but are not. Who had the security access throughout the buildings? Who had access to these high-tech incendiaries? Credible research is being done by this, by the way, by others. AE 9/11 Truth focuses on the science involved here. So the evidence you've seen is just a small fraction of that which is available to the 9/11 Truth movement and to you. It's been assembled. We made it easy. We have DVDs. They're right outside facing you as you walk out the door. So again, the questions raised are numerous and ominous that must be answered in a real investigation, which we've never had. So this is just the beginning of, admittedly, a disturbing but essential duty for you to go back into the nightmare of 9/11 and uncover the rest of the mystery and take massive action to expose this deep state crime. Because 9/11 is the key issue that changes everything and wakes people up to the manifold rabbit holes, the crimes against humanity. So where do you draw your line in the sand? Do you wait for the next false flag operation, foretold by some within the deep state, to be far worse than the last 9/11? No. Speak out now, for a time comes when your silence is betrayal. As Larkin Rose told us earlier, and Max Egan. Thank you so much, everybody.